Times Square's debt clock shows a number defying human comprehension as it spins past $35 trillion, heading rapidly toward $38 trillion. Stack 38 trillion $1 bills on top of each other, and the pile reaches not just to the moon, but beyond it. Politicians and economists have dismissed this number for decades, telling us deficits don't matter because we owe the money to ourselves or that the debt is manageable as long as the economy grows. They treated national debt like a video game scorecard, a high number that looks scary but has no real-world consequences. But 2024 changed the math. We've entered a new era of fiscal reality where debt is no longer just a number, but a predator beginning to consume the United States government's budget. For the first time in history, the U.S. government spends more on interest payments on debt than it spends on national defense. We're spending more to pay off bondholders of the past than to equip the military of the present, spending more on interest than on the entire Medicaid program, and the interest bill alone approaches $1 trillion a year. This creates a terrifying phenomenon known as the debt spiral. Normal households with too much debt cut spending by stopping eating out and canceling Netflix. But government is not a household. Massive portions of U.S. government spending are mandatory, Social Security and Medicare, promises made to an aging population that cannot be politically broken. The government cannot cut spending, so to pay interest on old debt, the government issues new debt. It's borrowing from a new credit card to pay the minimum monthly balance on the old credit card, which increases total debt and increases interest payments next year, requiring even more borrowing. It's a mathematical feedback loop leading to exponential growth, and the terrifying reality is there's no conventional way out of this trap. Only 3 traditional ways exist to reduce a sovereign debt burden of this magnitude, and 2 are politically impossible in the United States today. First option is austerity, meaning massive tax hikes and brutal spending cuts. Balancing the budget and starting to pay down debt would require doubling income taxes or abolishing the U.S. military, and neither is going to happen. Any politician proposing cutting Social Security checks by 30% commits political suicide, while any president proposing a 70% tax rate gets voted out in a landslide. The American economy is addicted to government spending, and pulling the plug would trigger a Great Depression instantly, so austerity is off the table. Second option is default, where the government simply walks up to the podium saying we're not paying, which is what Argentina or Russia has done in the past. But for the United States, issuer of the global reserve currency. This is the nuclear option because the entire global financial system, every bank and every pension fund and every trade contract is built on the foundation that U.S. Treasury bonds are risk-free. U.S. default means the global banking system collapses overnight. Trade stops and credit cards stop working in a financial apocalypse, so explicit default is also off the table. That leaves only one option, the third option, the option every empire in history, from Rome to Weimar Germany to post-war Britain, has eventually chosen. It's the path of least resistance, the soft default. You don't refuse to pay the debt, but pay every single cent of it in currency that's worth significantly less than when you borrowed it. You print the difference. This isn't conspiracy theory, but the official, though unspoken policy of the United States government, a process of financial repression designed to transfer wealth from savers to the state. Before we continue, though, understanding how governments inflate away debt rather than pay it back honestly diverges sharply from what financial advisors tell you. Real wealth protection requires understanding these monetary manipulation strategies, so hit that subscribe button because it helps the channel and these debt spiral mechanics need exposing. Drop a comment too because I want knowing which tool you think is most dangerous. The goal is keeping the interest rate on debt lower than the rate of inflation. If the government owes $30 trillion and inflation is 5%, the real value of that debt shrinks by 5% every year. In purchasing power terms, the government has just erased $1.5 trillion of debt in a single year without raising a single tax or cutting a single program. Bondholders get their money back, but that money buys fewer groceries and fewer houses, disguised as supply chain issues or transitory inflation. We're currently witnessing a historic shift in monetary policy called fiscal dominance. For 40 years, the Federal Reserve was the master raising interest rates to fight inflation, even if it hurt the economy. But today, the Treasury is the master. The debt is so high that the Fed cannot raise interest rates high enough to truly kill inflation, because doing so would bankrupt the U.S. government. If interest rates went to 10% like they did in the 1980s, the interest payments on $38 trillion would be $3.8 trillion a year, more than the total tax revenue of the country, and the government would collapse. So the Fed is forced to tolerate higher inflation and forced to keep rates lower than they should be, and forced to become an enabler of the Treasury's spending. The independence of the central bank is dying as we move into an era where the money printer is permanently fused to the government budget. This is the hidden crisis. It isn't a sudden crash, but a slow boil where the 38 trillion number will keep going up, hitting 40 trillion, then 50 trillion, while the value of the dollar keeps going down. The government is betting it can inflate away the debt faster than the market can panic. It's a dangerous high-wire act, because if they print too slowly, the debt crushes them, but if they print too fast, they trigger hyperinflation. They're trying to thread the needle by running inflation at 4 or 5% for a decade. This sounds manageable, but the compound effect is devastating, because at 5% inflation, the value of your savings is cut in half in 14 years. That's the plan. Wipe out half the value of national debt and half the value of your savings by the mid-2030s. But how do they pull this off without you noticing? 3 modern tools make the theft invisible. To understand how the government plans to make 38 trillion disappear, you don't need a crystal ball, but just a history book, because we're not in uncharted territory, but rerunning the exact economic playbook used by the United States after World War II. In 1945, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio hit 119%. The government didn't pay it off with taxes and didn't default, but liquidated the debt through negative real interest rates. And for a decade, the Federal Reserve capped interest rates at 2.5%, while inflation averaged over 6%. Every year, bondholders lost 3.5% of their purchasing power in a deliberate transfer of wealth from savers to the state. Today, this strategy is back, but upgraded with 3 modern tools designed to ensure you don't notice the theft until it's too late. Tool 1 is the captive buyer. In a free market, if government is 38 trillion in debt and spending recklessly, investors would demand higher interest rates to lend money, saying you're a risky borrower, so pay me 10%. But the US government cannot afford 10%, so it rigs the market by creating a captive audience. Through banking regulations like Basel III and Dodd-Frank, the government forces banks and insurance companies and pension funds to hold US Treasury bonds. Regulators designate US Treasuries as high-quality liquid assets, where banks are legally required to hold these assets to satisfy their liquidity coverage ratios, and it doesn't matter if the bonds pay 0.1% or if they're losing value because banks must buy them to stay in business. This creates artificial demand, forcing the financial system to lend money to the government at suppressed rates regardless of risk. Your pension fund isn't buying government debt because it's a good investment, but because it's against the law not to. Tool 2 is the broken compass, the CPI. If you want to pay people less, but you promise to pay them based on inflation, the easiest solution is redefining inflation. Social Security payments and tips are linked to the Consumer Price Index, and if CPI is 10%, the government has to pay out 10% more, so the government has a multi-billion-dollar incentive to keep CPI low. Since the 1980s, the methodology for calculating CPI has been quietly rewritten to suppress the official number. They introduced substitution bias, where the logic is, if steak price goes up, you won't buy steak, but will buy hamburger. Therefore, your cost of living hasn't gone up as much as steak price suggests. The CPI tracks the hamburger, effectively ignoring the fact that your standard of living dropped. They introduced hedonic adjustments, where if a new car costs $5,000 more than the old model but has better safety features, the government argues the price didn't really go up. The price increase is adjusted down because quality is higher. These statistical sleights of hand save the government billions. If we use the 1980 methodology today, inflation would consistently be double the official number, which means the government is gaslighting you about the cost of your own survival to save its budget. Tool 3 is the central bank put. When foreign nations like China or Japan stop buying U.S. debt, which they've started to do, the Fed steps in as the buyer of last resort, printing money to buy the bonds nobody else wants. This is quantitative easing, where by buying the debt, the Fed artificially suppresses the yield, keeping the government's interest bill affordable, but it floods the economy with new dollars. The result is stock markets going up and real estate going up, and the price of assets disconnecting from reality in the everything bubble. It creates the illusion of wealth, where your 401k looks higher and your house value looks higher, but it's a monetary mirage. You have more dollars, but those dollars buy less than they did 10 years ago. The government is effectively paying off its debt by diluting your share of the pie. The verdict: you're the one paying off the national debt. The U.S. government is not going to default, but going to inflate, keeping interest rates below the real rate of inflation for the next decade. This is the silent eraser. If you keep your money in a savings account earning 4%, while real inflation is 8%, you are the one paying off the national debt. You are the donor class. But this process isn't hitting everyone equally, because in fact, it's the primary engine of growing inequality, tearing the United States apart. The Cantillon effect: why inflation makes the rich richer. To understand why, we have to revisit an 18th century French economist named Richard Cantillon, who observed a phenomenon now known as the Cantillon effect. He realized that where new money enters the economy matters. When the Federal Reserve prints $1 trillion, they don't drop it from helicopters over Iowa and don't mail a check to every citizen, but inject it into the financial sector, buying bonds from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and BlackRock. These institutions get the new money first at zero interest and use this free cash to buy assets like stocks and real estate and technology companies. By the time this new money trickles down to the average worker in the form of wages, prices have already risen. The rich get the money before inflation, while the poor get the money after inflation. This is why, since 2008, we've seen a K-shaped economy. The asset-owning class, the top 10%, has seen their wealth explode because the Fed is pumping up the value of their stocks and homes, while the wage-earning class, the bottom 90%, has seen their purchasing power collapse because their wages cannot keep up with the price of rent and groceries. The national debt is effectively being paid off by liquidating the American middle class, the death of safe savings, and the rise of forced speculation. This dynamic is forcing a fundamental change in how we must think about saving. For the last 40 years, standard advice was work hard and save 10% of your income and put it in a bank and buy government bonds in the 60-40 portfolio designed for a world where money held its value. In a world of fiscal dominance, this advice is financial suicide. If you save in cash, you're guaranteed to lose, and if you buy government bonds, you're guaranteed to lose purchasing power. We're entering an era of forced speculation. To simply preserve your wealth, you're forced to take risks, having to buy stocks or real estate or crypto just to outrun currency devaluation. The government has turned the entire economy into a casino where you must gamble to survive because the safe option, saving, is being deliberately destroyed. The final tool waiting in the basement, CBDCs. But the final tool in the government's arsenal hasn't been deployed yet because it's currently being built in the basement of the Federal Reserve, the central bank digital currency. Right now, the government's ability to manipulate the economy is limited by physical cash. If the Fed sets interest rates to -5% to wipe out debt faster, you would simply pull your cash out of the bank and hide it under your mattress to avoid the penalty. Physical cash is the ultimate check on government power, allowing you to exit the banking system, but a CBDC removes that exit. If the dollar becomes purely digital, the Federal Reserve gains total control. They can implement negative interest rates instantly, deducting 1% from your balance every month to force you to spend, and they can implement expiry dates on money, telling you that your stimulus check must be spent within 30 days or it vanishes. This isn't science fiction, but already being tested in China with the digital yuan. The digital dollar is the ultimate solution to the debt crisis, giving the state power to micromanage the velocity of money and confiscate wealth with a few lines of code. The transition to a cashless society isn't about convenience, but about control, ensuring there's no escape valve when the great wealth transfer accelerates. The verdict: Asset survival is the only strategy. The United States is defaulting through a slow, polite, bureaucratic default, but it's a default nonetheless. The $38 trillion will never be paid back in real terms. The winners will be those who own scarce assets like real estate and gold and Bitcoin and profitable businesses, things that cannot be printed. The losers will be those who trust the currency and the institutions. The American dream of saving your way to prosperity is dead, and we're now in the game of asset survival. But history shows that when governments get truly desperate, they stop being subtle and stop asking, but simply take. In 1933, the United States government, the land of the free, did exactly that by criminalizing ownership of the one asset, allowing citizens to protect themselves from inflation. Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, seizing the gold of every American citizen under the threat of 10 years in prison. The terrifying legal precedent allows the president to seize your Bitcoin and gold and 401k during a national emergency today, which means you need knowing if your safe is actually safe. Thanks for watching. Here's what I want knowing from you, though. If you had to choose just one scarce asset to protect yourself from this debt spiral, would you prioritize real estate for its tangibility, gold for its historical track record, or Bitcoin for its portability and limited supply? That choice determines whether you survive the great wealth transfer with your purchasing power intact, or whether you become part of the liquidated middle class. So drop your take in the comments because I genuinely want hearing which asset you're betting on. Smash that like button to keep the signal alive, and subscribe because next time we're telling the full uncensored story of the 1933 gold seizure, uncovering the secret prosecutions and the legal loopholes the wealthy used to escape. I'll see you in the vault.